Welcome everyone to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a hard look at the very real, very pressing global displacement crisis. Every year, the UN Refugee Agency, or UNHCR, releases a massive trove of data, and it essentially acts as a report card on how the international community is handling forced displacement. We've synthesized the absolute latest reports and analysis from organizations like HIAS and Church World Service to bring you the unfiltered data reality check. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our highly organized agenda, which is going to serve as a roadmap to break down these overwhelming global crises into logical, digestible components. We'll start with global displacement by the numbers, then look at origins and host countries, examine the global resettlement bottleneck, and finally, wrap up with renewing the commitment. Section 1. Global displacement by the numbers. Now, large numbers can totally numb the brain, so we absolutely must ground this data in reality. 1 in 70. That is a jarring statistic straight from the latest data. Currently, 1 in every 70 people globally is forcibly displaced. Just pause and think about that for a second. Imagine your neighborhood, your school, or your workplace, and apply that ratio. It really puts the immense scale of human movement happening right now into perspective. Now, at first glance, the overall trend line actually shows a slight numerical decline. The total number of displaced people in the world dropped from 123 million in 2024 to 117.8 million at the end of 2025. But hold on, before we celebrate this decrease, we need to look much closer at what actually drove this shift in the data. That reduction, it's largely driven by nearly 15 million refugees and internally displaced people returning home. That sounds super positive on the surface, right? Well, the UN's grim reality check reveals that most of these returns have occurred under what they call adverse circumstances. People are going back to areas with persistent insecurity, a severe lack of basic services, and heavily damaged infrastructure. So these aren't exactly the safe, sustainable homecomings we'd hope for.
And because the underlying crises causing all this remain totally unresolved, Church World Service projects a stark reversal of this slight dip. They estimate that global displacement could hit an astounding 136 million by the end of 2026. Basically, the crisis is far from over. It's simply shifting and ultimately expanding.
Let's move to and see how this builds. Section 2. Origins and host countries. We need to look at exactly where refugees are coming from and where they're going.
To really wrap our heads around this crisis, the data shows that the vast majority of people are fleeing a very concentrated set of protracted crises. Nearly half of all internally displaced people come from just a handful of countries, with Sudan, Syria, and Afghanistan right at the top of the list. This tells us that focused diplomatic efforts in these specific regions have the potential to enable tens of millions of people to safely return home if the right conditions are actually met.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is it completely busts a common myth. Despite the political rhetoric you might hear out there, the vast majority of refugees do not go to wealthy nations. High-income countries hosted just 29% of the world's refugees last year. The rest, the overwhelming majority, are seeking safety in low- and middle-income countries. Let's narrow in on the least developed countries specifically. They're hosting 26% of the world's refugees, yet cumulatively, they account for just over 1% of the global gross domestic product. Highlighting this severe 1% GDP disparity creates an instant realization about the massive economic burden placed on low-income host nations who are stepping up to provide refuge. To put some names to these numbers, consider that just 6 countries host over a third of all refugees globally. Consider the incredibly heavy loads carried by Colombia and Chad. Colombia hosted 2.8 million displaced people last year, largely from neighboring Venezuela. Chad hosts 1.5 million people, mostly fleeing the massive crisis in Sudan. These nations are facing their own major internal challenges, yet they remain the primary destinations for those seeking international protection. Which brings us to Section 3, the global resettlement bottleneck. This is really the climax of the explainer.
There's a severe disconnect between the growing need for safety and the actual pathways available. With 2.9 million refugees requiring resettlement, meaning they literally cannot return home and face acute risks exactly where they are, how many actually received it in 2025?
The answer is just 81,800. Let that sink in. That means less than 3% of the global need was met. And what's worse, this number represents a drastic drop. Global resettlement decreased by more than half compared to previous years. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly where this bottleneck is coming from across the top 3 traditional host countries. Canada's numbers dropped by 21% to 38,800 people,
Australia actually went against the trend, increasing its admissions by 9% to 18,800. But the absolute most significant driver of the global decline was the United States.
U.S. admissions dropped by a staggering 89% from the previous year, landing at just 11,500 people resettled in 2025. This massive drop is a direct factual outcome of policy changes implemented by the Trump administration to the long-standing U.S. refugee admissions program. Because the U.S. program has historically been the world's largest, policy shifts there naturally have a dramatic and immediate ripple effect on the global resettlement totals.
Section 4. Renewing the commitment. Here's where we look at the calls to action.
It is so crucial to remember the human urgency behind all these statistics. Behind every single data point is a real person requiring vital services to recover from trauma and rebuild their life. Organizations like HIASC point out that when displaced people finally find refuge, they desperately need economic empowerment and mental health support, whether that means fostering integration in host communities or ensuring that returns home are truly safe and dignified. Basic protection absolutely must be matched with opportunity.
So, the crucial point is summarized perfectly by Rick Santos, the president and CEO of Church World Service. He states, "Given the scale of needs and the dramatic drop in resettlement, we have a responsibility to defend refuge." It's a really powerful call from humanitarian groups for a renewed global commitment to asylum, asking the international community to uphold international refugee law. We're going to leave you with this final provocative thought. We've seen the data reality check today. Massive displacement on one side and drastically shrinking resettlement pathways on the other. How will the global community bridge the massive gap between the 117.8 million displaced and the shrinking pathways to refuge? The numbers are crystal clear and the scale of the challenge is stark. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and we really encourage you to keep exploring the realities behind the data.